Today's lesson in coercive bargaining. Sometimes you need to go big or go home. Half measures may only cost you money and not produce the outcome that you want. It is a busy week in international affairs. The media's and social media's predominant focus is on the upcoming summit between Putin and Trump in Alaska. It has been a long time since those two leaders met face to face. In fact, you would also have to go back to before Russia's invasion of Ukraine to even find a meeting with Biden. Regardless, I think that most of the discussion surrounding that is idle speculation for the moment, best suited for a Q&A video over on my secondary channel. So if you have a question about that, please leave a comment below, and I will see you tomorrow. For now, though, I want to focus on a specific piece of the coercive bargaining puzzle that I can speak more definitively about: secondary sanctions. Yes, the Trump administration has started pursuing a new strategy to force the Kremlin to be serious about negotiating an end to the conflict. Go after Russia's cash. Of course, the West has tried to do that from the start. What is new here is that the Trump administration's sights have now shifted to the Kremlin's financial partners. If you are running out of sanctions to place directly on Russia, then threaten sanctions against the countries that have increased support to the Kremlin since the start of the war. With any luck, they will stop trading with Russia. Then, running out of money, the Kremlin will have to broker an agreement to end the war. Well, we are getting our first taste of this: a 25% tariff on Indian goods exported to the United States, beginning on August 27th. That is on top of another 25% that the Trump administration levied on August 7th, related to ongoing trade relations. Well, previously I covered the big picture outlook of such secondary sanctions. Go watch that one if you want an overview of the strategy. Today, though, I want to hammer down the mechanics behind the implementation, because secondary sanctions can work. However, there is good reason to think that these in particular will not, or at least not unless they are a harbinger of something bigger. Let me explain. The basic principle here is that Trump wants to leverage the U.S. trade relationship with India to convince Modi that maintaining that relationship is more important than buying discounted Russian oil. In raw numbers, it is $88 billion in Indian exports to the United States annually. Meanwhile, India purchased about 1.6 million barrels of oil per day from Russia in the first half of 2025, representing the largest increase among any country since the start of the invasion. It varies, but India might receive a $5 discount on the price by buying from the ostracized regime instead of the international market. I am sure that you will see plenty of comparisons between the two values in the upcoming weeks. But doing that correctly is easier said than done. What actually matters here is opportunity cost. Questions like, how much more expensive would it be for India to buy oil from Saudi Arabia instead? How easily can India find alternative buyers for its exports? What portion of those oil purchases become irrelevant if U.S. exports disappear? Well, leave that to the bureaucrats to calculate. Let's stick to the high-level dilemma for today. Our next step is to walk through how the strategic interaction works. At a basic level, the United States sets a tariff level. India sees the selection, and then chooses whether to continue purchasing Russian oil or to end the relationship. If India continues purchasing, the tariff indeed comes into effect. Let's call the trade value for the United States V sub US as a function of T. Analogously, India's trade value is V sub I, also as a function of T. Reminder here that I am referring to the value added from trade, not the raw dollar or rupee amounts. Either way, tariffs create all sorts of nasty economic distortions, so those values both decrease as a function of T. And just so we are clear, yes, the Trump administration finds these tariffs costly, at least to some degree, and certainly past a particular point. That is why you have seen the White House back down from so many tariff threats regarding the trade war. Higher tariffs also come with retaliation from the other side, meant to directly hurt the United States, and indeed where it might hurt the most, say like halting a $3.6 billion deal to purchase US jets. And even where the United States has now imposed tariffs, note they are not set to 10,000%. They end up being much milder. Back to what is happening here. Because the oil trade continues, India gets the benefit of running its economy on cheap Russian energy stocks. Call that benefit B. Meanwhile, the United States loses coercive leverage vis-a-vis Russia as part of the effort to negotiate a ceasefire with Ukraine. Call that cost of lost leverage C. In contrast, if India forsakes Russian oil, trade continues uninhibited with zero tariffs. Nothing extra to worry about regarding benefits from Russian oil purchases or lost coercive leverage over here either. That is why those values are up there and not down there. Please hold comments about the Trump administration setting a tariff of 0 in the absence of Russian concerns for a moment, because there will be a problem when things look like this instead. Okay, let's look at India's main dilemma. As long as those bureaucrats are good at estimating all of the benefits and losses of the various trade relations, we just compare these two values. If the value of US trade with tariffs plus the benefits of Russian oil are larger than the value of US trade sans tariffs, then India ought to keep buying the Russian oil. If the opposite is true, then it is time to dump the Russian oil. Note that it is possible that even with an infinite tariff, which implicitly sets the trade value for both parties to 0, because no trade happens at all anymore, the benefits of Russian oil could be so large that India would still go with that, even if it meant completely disconnecting from the United States with its trade relationship. Now, I understand that saying India ought to do what is most profitable for India is not exactly an earth-shattering insight. But I should point out here that if Trump has a higher optimal tariff than 0 for pure trade relation reasons, say 25%, it becomes more difficult for this condition to hold. That is, India's value for free trade is larger than its value for somewhat restricted trade, which means it is easier for the oil benefit to win the day. Well, 25% is actually what was happening before this. So this is my not-so-subtle way of saying that the Liberation Day world that we live in is undermining US policy toward Ukraine. Meanwhile, there is a more interesting implication if we peel things back a layer. Think about the United States' dilemma. The goal is to get India to go this way. Well, in the case where India does better by buying Russian oil, even when tariffs end all trade, this is not possible. The United States should just give up on the policy. I do not think that we can rule this possibility out. Hold that thought for a moment. Under less extreme circumstances, though, there is some critical threshold of tariffs that flips India's preference. I will use T* to denote that value. Okay, think about the United States' outcome as a function of the tariff that it levies. Below the critical threshold, the tariff reduces trade benefits and does not change India's decision to import Russian oil. Again, that is because India views the trade damage as small, and so the value of oil trumps it. Moreover, such small tariffs do not even give India the ability to leverage the damage of lost trade to negotiate with Russia a lower price on the oil, which would otherwise be a partial victory for the United States. As a result, the quality of the United States' outcome declines as the tariff increases. Or maybe for trade purposes, the White House's optimal tariff is still bound above 0. However, that is beside the point for what I am illustrating today, which is that once you pop over the critical threshold, assuming one exists, India just gives up. The United States never actually has to impose the tariff, and it gets the benefit of eliminating payments to Russia. The result is a great payoff for the United States, which we can illustrate on the payoff graph like this. Well, maybe there are some minor losses for scaring the market with progressively larger tariff threats, but whatever is happening over on this end, The key thing is that there is an inexorable jump in the quality of outcome for the United States by setting a sufficiently high tariff. And sure, I am trying to illustrate the logic of what is happening here in a very simplified environment. There are no renegotiations. We are mostly thinking about this in terms of economic welfare. The United States will uphold whatever tariff it imposes. There is no uncertainty over how India will respond to any given tariff, and so forth. I will return to a couple of these key points later. But again, this jump is inexorable. That is what happens whenever sufficient pain causes a sudden switch in how an opponent will respond. And it leads to this video's main point. Optimal sanctions here follow a go big or go home strategy. Cue Mike Ehrmantraut complaining about half measures. Slaps on the wrist still see the target prefer importing Russian oil, which does not change the core economic situation involving the war. If you are going to pursue a tariff policy, it must be forceful. Otherwise, you end up draining both sides' economies without any real benefit. Note that this is different than the standard economic sanctions that directly target the underlying offender, primary sanctions to the secondary sanctions, if you will. There, you actively want to drain the other side's economy. The less money that they are making, the less money that they have available for the war effort. But with secondary sanctions, the health of the target's economy is irrelevant. The United States only obtains a policy benefit from India dropping its support for Russia. Reading the various criticisms of Trump's plan online, the bulk of them are geared toward this just being another case of Trump imposing tariffs, and all tariffs being bad. And certainly I have spent way too much time on this channel explaining why tariffs are, broadly speaking, a really bad thing for a country's economy. Correspondingly, it is possible that imposing any tariff in this case could be the wrong play. That would correspond to the case where India sticks with the Russian oil, regardless of the size of the tariff that the United States imposes. But I suspect that a lot of the online commentary fails to realize that there is massive bipartisan support for the secondary tariffs on Capitol Hill, because economic sanctions like these are a common strategy to apply pressure on policy dimensions that one's country finds objectionable. Actually, the Senate's plan calls for 500% tariffs instead. Go big indeed. And to be further clear, this is not some sort of rogue US policy. It also has European support, despite Europe's own uncomfortable relationship with still importing Russian energy. Now, zooming out a bit, there is a reason why you might not want to set the secondary sanctions to infinity to ensure that the policy will work. I have illustrated India's response to the tariffs as a precise science that the United States could perfectly anticipate. In practice, we know that anticipating these things ahead of time can be difficult, and that poor information can indeed lead to some very bad outcomes. Here, the United States might be unsure where the critical tariff cut point falls, or if it even exists at all, as we illustrated a minute ago. In turn, the game becomes calculating a tariff that balances the chances of forcing India to back down, versus the downside risk of paying for the cost of ineffective tariffs. It is a Vegas-style roll of the dice, where you have to accept some risk to have some chance of obtaining a better outcome. The real issue here is that 25% tariffs cause an amount of damage to India that will not plausibly result in a meaningful chance of India giving up. Thus, even accounting for this type of uncertainty, it is not a reasonable policy to pursue. Still, there is one pathway that this could all work out. Imagine instead that India is suspicious of the Trump administration's commitment to the tariff policy, a concern that we were ignoring with our baseline strategic interaction. Actually, you probably do not have to imagine that. There is enough discussion of that online already, though I should note that policymakers are more attuned to the fact that the United States has imposed plenty of tariffs since Trump came into office. I guess that Toko does not quite have the same ring to it. There is also the whiplash in Ukraine-Russia policy, and how much Trump values placing additional coercive leverage on Russia, which is hard even for the political elites to track. You could imagine a world where India would want to back down if the United States would sustain massive tariffs over the long term. However, there is doubt that Trump has that sort of commitment. Trump may have a very mild interest in it, but that is all. In other words, Trump would like to see India cut Russia from its oil sheets, but simultaneously, Trump is not willing to pay a large cost to accomplish that task. Maybe Trump really wants this as a matter of increasing U.S. oil sales, and that's what's going on here. Then a small tariff may be helpful. It is a costly signal that Trump cares about the issues at stake, at least to some degree. Otherwise, he would be unwilling to bear even the price of a 25% tariff. So, if you, dear viewer, are here from the future and can tell me that the 25% tariff actually worked, then this would be my best guess as to how. India took it as a warning shot. There was some heated rhetoric exchanged, and India swore that it would never capitulate to this type of coercion. However, Trump warned that the tariffs would only increase. Modi, seeing that Trump had already started down this road, believed him, and quit before things got worse. But this narrative is a stretch. As it stands, a 25% tariff does not cause all that much pain to the United States. Consequently, India would have to think that the White House does not care at all about the situation for that amount of damage to meaningfully update its beliefs about what the Trump administration's next move will be. And that is why I am still skeptical about this strategy. It is just another way that Trump is taking mild action to keep himself as a part of the news cycle, rather than bear risk on a policy that could actually pay dividends. Or he is just using it to apply further coercive leverage to India on the trade dimension, while trying to co-opt all of that bipartisan support for secondary sanctions on Capitol Hill. Either way, it is not improving Ukraine's situation. Meanwhile, what you should not be skeptical about is the quality of these fantastic books about the war. Check the video description for more information about them. Also, write me a question down below if you are curious about the upcoming Trump-Putin summit, and you will hear from me soon on Lines on Maps Extra. And if you enjoyed this video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.